Good evening, everyone, and welcome to St. Thomas More for the first of our Catholic faculty series this fall. Long-running series, these lectures are intended to introduce students and the wider Yale community to Catholic professors who have achieved excellence in their respective fields. I'm Colin Hoke, the new education coordinator here at St. Thomas More, and I'm especially pleased to be introducing a dear friend of mine, my doctoral co-advisor in the history department, Professor Carlos Eire. Professor Eire is the T. Lawrason Riggs Professor of History and Religious Studies, named after Yale's first Catholic chaplain and the founder of St. Thomas More. Professor Eire's chair was the very first chair in Roman Catholic Studies at a secular American university. After receiving his Ph.D. in history from Yale in 1979, he went on to teach at St. John's University in Minnesota, the University of Virginia, and from 1996 onwards, here at Yale. He might be familiar to many of you in this room and those watching at home from his interviews in the news media and from his regular courses here at Yale on the Christian mysticism, Reformation Europe, and the Catholic intellectual tradition. A prolific scholar, Professor Eire specializes in the social, intellectual, and religious history of late medieval and early modern Europe. He focuses on the Protestant and the Catholic Reformations, the history of popular piety, the history of the supernatural, and the history of death itself. His most recent publications include The Life of St. Teresa of Avila, Biography, Princeton 2019, and They Flew, A History of the Impossible, Yale 2023, for which we had an event here at Thomas More. In addition to his historical scholarship, Professor Eire has brought his Catholic faith to bear as an award-winning autobiographer and as an advocate for political refugees taking refuge from totalitarian regimes. Here now to speak to us about how his Catholic faith has influenced his scholarship, his autobiographical work, and his political advocacy, please join me in welcoming Professor Carlos Eire.
Good evening. It's good to see all of you here, and it's a great honor and privilege to be here speaking to you about this way in which scholarship and a life of faith intertwine or sometimes don't. So I'd like to begin with a story, a real event that happened here, which is sort of sets the theme for my talk, which is that, number one, you can expect the unexpected in life as well as in scholarship. And number two is that you can always count on ending up places, doing things you never expected to be or to do. So, the Catholic Intellectual Tradition course a few years back, after a discussion section, one of the students said, "Could you please stay for a few minutes? I have a problem I'd like to discuss with you." And he said, I'm thinking of transitioning to the Catholic faith. But I grew up evangelical Protestant, and I'm still very disturbed by predestination. He was a math major. So he said, "Do you mind if I write a formula on the blackboard?" So he had reduced Calvinist predestination to a mathematical formula and wrote it on the board. Having failed math in high school, I had no idea what was on the board, even though he explained it to me. So he says, here's my problem. I said, well, what happens if you change this variable from here and put it here? Oh, no, that won't work. So well, what about if you move this variable here and put it over there? That won't work. I was trying to explain to him that in Catholic theology, predestination and free will do not cancel each other out. And that was what was giving him a problem. So without knowing what I was doing, just simply taking shots in the dark, I said, what if you move, for the third or fourth time, move this variable here? And he fell to his knees, literally, and said, thank you. I no longer have a problem with predestination. I still don't know what I did. And I still basically don't know how I ended up here, doing what I do. In case you don't know, I wasn't supposed to be here. I was born in a different country, and a bad place, a really bad place. Came to the United States without my parents, so I was basically an orphan for 3 years. I came from Cuba on a program sponsored by the Catholic Church, rescuing children from communist, atheistic totalitarianism. The reason that children were coming without their parents is that children were given visa waivers. We didn't have to have security clearances. So the kids could get out really fast. The plan always was the parents will follow, or that stupid regime will collapse and, everybody will come back. Didn't happen that way. 14,000 kids left between 1961 and the missile crisis of October of 1962, when the door slammed shut and the parents of about half of us or more were trapped. My mother, for instance, had an exit permit for November something of 1962, and the door slammed shut October 26th, 1962, and it took 3.5 years for her to end up joining me and my brother. So, first family I lived with, my first foster parents, were Jewish Americans, second generation. I thought I had it made, because here's where I'm trying to get into the faith thing. Nothing scared me more as a child than a Catholic church and Catholic images. They terrified me. Spanish Catholicism can get a little gory, especially in the sacred art. So, no one scared me more than Jesus, especially because my dad had all sorts of religious art in the house, and he had a concave dish that had the face of Jesus on it, and no matter where you stood in the room, the eyes would follow you. It was really scary. So I thought, I'm living with a Jewish family now, I won't have to go to Mass anymore and be scared. But they forced me to go to church and gave me money to put in the collection plate. All this, even though my foster father, God bless him, lovely man. He was not only Jewish, but a Jewish atheist, and yet forced me to go to church. That's when things started looking a little peculiar to me. I ended up living various places, including 9 months in a home for juvenile delinquents. Last place I thought I would end up was Yale. And then ended up living with an uncle who came at the very last minute and was relocated to Bloomington, Illinois, where I spent 2 years, 2 months and 2 days, wonderful 2 years, 2 months, 2 days. But there, I was very surprised that the people who helped us the most were the Presbyterians and the Methodists. So I started thinking a little differently about my faith. Jesus still scared me. But here's what happened, and this is why I say you expect the unexpected. When I left Cuba in April of 1962, at that time, you couldn't take anything with you, no matter what your age was. You took 2 changes of clothing. That's all you were allowed. 1 hat, 1 coat, and 1 book. And of course, my mom picked the book to give me. And it was the scariest book in the world, The Imitation of Christ by Thomas à Kempis. So I don't know if this is a Spanish tradition or a Cuban tradition. It was very Protestant in a sense. This is the advice I was given. You're going to be all by yourself. Whenever you have any questions or any problems, just open that Kempis book at random and point your finger at some place on the page, and you'll get an answer from God. Every time I did that, it scared me to death. It was all about self-emptying, letting go of things, embracing suffering, taking joy in suffering, actually, and joining Jesus in suffering. Last thing I wanted to hear. But then as time passed and I moved into my teens, I very, very gradually and slowly began to realize that what was really scary was not Jesus, but the world. And the book started to make sense to me. And it allowed me to do two things. It worked wonders. And I'll tell you, the book still scares me to death. But it allowed me to leave everything behind. You know, exiles, refugees often spend an awful lot of time, can't help it, thinking about everything they have lost. The book helped me lose everything joyfully. And more than that, it somehow made God real. So move forward a few years. Next thing I know, I'm a sophomore in high school. And I'm not only reading The Imitation of Christ, but other books, including the New Testament. Oh my God. Ooh. And I had a conversion experience of sorts. And I decided when I was a sophomore in high school that I wanted to teach history of my faith. I did this probably because in my house growing up, the past was always much more important than the present. And I set my goals on that. At first I thought I wanted to teach high school because that's all I knew. But as soon as I got to college, I said, oh, this is the gig. This is it. This is what I want to do. And I learned I needed a Ph.D. and I needed to learn all these languages. And oh my God, oh Lord. I went to a Jesuit school, Loyola, Chicago. And at that time, they still had a lot of Jesuits actually teaching, something that doesn't happen too often anymore at Jesuit schools. They taught me how to think. They taught me how to be a scholar, even though most of my Jesuit professors were not published scholars. They were tops in their field. And then to help me along in philosophy class, I actually was given true and false and multiple choice exams in metaphysics. Aristotelian metaphysics, Thomistic metaphysics. So I was prepared to come to Yale for a doctorate. And my mom confessed to me shortly before she passed away that as I was preparing to come here for graduate school, her friends ran an intervention. And they all descended on her to convince her she couldn't let me waste my life getting a Ph.D. in religious studies and history. What a waste of talent. So I ended up here, and I didn't expect to come back at any other time, but I ended up here. So that blackboard incident to me, when it happened, it brought all of this to mind. Because how did I get here? It's a line from an old Talking Heads song. How did I get here? Then I always join that blackboard incident with another. It happened at the University of Virginia. I had been teaching my mysticism course for several years, And I always began the very first lecture. I would warn the class, these texts we're going to be reading are very strange. And the people who wrote them are very strange too. As a matter of fact, these are the kind of people you don't want to sit next to on the bus usually, because they see things that other people don't see. And after that lecture, a student who had already taken 2 of my courses came up. I knew her very well. And all other professors I knew loved her. She was a straight A student and one of the brightest students at UVA at that time. But she came up and said, you hurt my feelings, Professor. I said, what do you mean? Well, how did I hurt your feelings? She said, I see things other people don't see all the time. So, if she was insane, as probably anyone in the medical profession would have said, she was highly functional. But she taught me a lesson. She taught me that the unseen world, the invisible world, the spiritual world, that had become part of my life, which I did not see. I wasn't like her. I wasn't seeing things that other people didn't see all the time. I never have. But that she was not afraid to refer to that reality as real. And connecting these 2 incidents at 2 different schools, these 2 very different students with 2 very different issues, it is in fact a very powerful reminder to me every time I think of these 2 incidents of what has interested me the most as a scholar, which is precisely that invisible world. I say that in the creed all the time. The creator of all things visible, and I love this footnote, and invisible. Because what is the basis of our faith? The basis of our faith is precisely the assertion or the belief in, assertion that there is a higher reality, that there is a higher being, and that the world we live in is temporary. And that as wonderful as this world is, and as joyful as it can be, and as painful, as scary as it can be, it's only temporary. And there is another dimension. So I have devoted my scholarly life continuously to looking precisely at that question in a very specific time period, a time period when beliefs changed, when the Protestant Reformation came along and denied many of the connections that had existed in Christianity between the material world and the spiritual world. I focused on how that change took place and what meaning it might have for us. 20th century or 21st century, what meaning does it have now? Because my first book, surprise, surprise, my dissertation, Protestant iconoclasm, Protestants who destroyed all those scary images. I had to know why, what's going on here. Second book, Attitudes Towards Death and the Afterlife in 16th Century Spain. I've actually mentioned this in some addresses I've given to public audiences, and it's been uproarious laughter when I mention the subject. Oh, yeah, how weird. So I spent, I can't tell you how many months, certainly over a year, reading wills from 16th century Madrid, looking for, number 1, how many masses people were requesting for their souls, and number 2, what kind of funeral were they arranging? And at one point in all this research and quantifying, I did a lot of quantifying despite my math inabilities. I had the strangest feeling come over me one time as I was counting masses. What if God has given me this job just so that I can count those masses? Maybe there are people elsewhere counting masses in other archives, and that's the way it works. Yeah, of course, that was silly, but I also had another thing happen to me doing that, which was I had a nightmare. The archive I was working with had nothing cataloged. I had to do my own cataloging. So I was cataloging last wills and testaments by year. And in my nightmare, I'm doing that. I'm looking through the list I had made already. And I saw my name on there with a date on it, date of death. Who? And I woke up. Of course, I didn't see the date, but there you have it. And then I went on to work on other things that have to relate in one way or another to the miraculous and the supernatural. And my latest work is on the history of the impossible. And why do I call it a history of the impossible? Because in our secular culture, and especially it doesn't matter what humanities discipline you work in or what social science discipline you work in, the assumption is that one cannot touch the subject of what people are believing in, what is really happening to them, or if there is actually any interaction between the spiritual and the material, the seen and the unseen, the visible and invisible. And to say that there might be such a thing that everyone deems impossible, that it is possible, puts you out on a limb. Kind of like the student that came up to me after class and said, you know, I see things people don't see all the time. It's risky. But risks have to be taken. And sometimes they come at you unexpectedly, and they come at you from places you don't expect for them to come. So, another transition in my life. That imitation of Christ taught me how to let go very, very well and very deeply. And I never thought about my Cuban past or the people I had left behind or actually being Cuban. I worked very hard at attaining this accent I have now. As a matter of fact, when I moved to Chicago from Bloomington, Illinois, which was right on the accent line in Illinois, between northern and twangy sort of southern accent. Kids in my high school used to ask, are you from the South? And I always said, yes, but you have no idea how far south. And I was already here at Yale. I mean, when I came here, I had 3 Cuban colleagues. I didn't have any other place I had taught previously. And they kind of turned a switch on, awakened me to my own past. And then in the year, late 1999, a little Cuban boy shows up off the coast of Florida. The raft or boat that his family had used to escape from Cuba had sank, and he was the only survivor. And many of you in this room won't remember this story, and how much time it took up on the evening news and how much space it took up in newspapers. The Cuban dictatorship started to ask for the boy to go back because every boy needed to be with his father. His father had remained in Cuba just like my dad, with one difference. His mother and father had separated before he was born, and he had never spent any time with his father. And then another difference. My father was not allowed to leave. And they couldn't have cared less about me not having a father. And here they say, oh, everybody needs to be with his father. And the news media were reporting this as just a family squabble. So I wrote to every news organization I could think of on my fancy Yale stationery with my fancy title. And I didn't get a single acknowledgement. What I was saying in that letter is, pay attention, this is all another issue. This government that is claiming to care about parentship has intentionally separated hundreds of thousands of families. And that's a fact. Well, I got really angry, and I got very Cuban all of a sudden. So I thought, how can I awaken the public about what's going on down there? So I decided to write a novel. I thought people read fiction, they get interested in it. But after trying to write the first chapter, I realized I have no imagination. So I wrote a memoir. I wrote a narrative of my childhood and sold it as fiction. And I was driven. The book is a very religious book. My faith is at every page of that book. I have proofs for the existence of God in that book. I also continually intone my own weird version of the Jesus prayer. And it's all about how mysterious life is and how important faith is. But most readers don't get that. They don't pick up on it. I think I was trained a little too well by my Jesuit professors at being subtle. But I did get hate mail from people who thought I was just a little too irreligious, not knowing that, when I write Jesus H. whip-wielding Christ as an expression, I mean it. That's the real Jesus who intervenes in this world. So anyway, the book ended up winning the National Book Award, much to my surprise. And then I suddenly had two careers. I was a professional Cuban. Actually, three lives. I was a professional Cuban, a professional author. No one had called me an author before, even though I had published 3 books before this one. If you write without footnotes, all of a sudden you're an author. So, the book was a great success. It's been translated into 12, 13 languages, except that it has not been published in any Spanish-speaking country. All the publishers in Spanish-speaking countries have refused to publish it for obvious reasons. And I had to balance those 2 lives. I still remember the day I came in to class after winning the National Book Award. And I walk into the classroom and one student started to clap. And then I noticed all the other students were looking at each other like, what's going on? And then they all started to clap. And I said, thank you. And I didn't say anything about the award. Because that's precisely my method, to sneak up on people, to sneak up and surprise my readers, my audiences, my students in ways that they don't expect, in the same way that I have been surprised constantly by things that I didn't think were possible and could not possibly happen. So every now and then, these little brief glimpses show through of what is impossible becoming possible. Those 2 students, that story in particular. But also, something that also happened with that other life I had as an author and professional Cuban. I was on a Yale alumni tour, going down the Elbe River from Prague to Berlin. And I was in Prague, and I wanted to visit the shrine of the Infant of Prague, because a priest who was a friend of my wife's had said, if you're in Prague, you have got to go to that chapel. But I was lost. I couldn't find it. Couldn't find it at all.
It's not worth finding.
I stumbled onto it. And it was Pentecost Eve, Saturday evening, Pentecost. So I went in, and I thank you. I said, oh, and then I heard the little bell. Mass was about to begin. Oh, but I won't be able to understand it. It's going to be in Czech. The priest comes out. Pentecost. It's in Spanish. I get back to the boat with the Yale alumni. And this Yale alum starts asking me how much I get paid by Yale. And then he says, Yale doesn't pay you enough. You got to find some other way of, claiming what's really yours, because you're worth a lot more than Yale pays you. And someone else at the table said, those lectures you've been giving us on the boat, they're not as interesting as your personal life. So I decided to write a sequel to my memoir and continue on that track. And also that's an even more religious book, though many people don't quite get it. The title of that book is Learning to Die in Miami. And the very first publication that contacted me that they wanted to do something about this book was the American Association of Retired Peoples. They thought it was about old folks going to Florida to die. Yeah. And also, to see, to think things just, God works in the strangest ways. He can be so surprising. The original title for my first memoir, which Simon & Schuster would not let me use, was Kiss the Lizard, Jesus. And that was a metaphor for all things we consider unpleasant in life that we have to kiss and embrace. But they wouldn't let me use it. So I got really angry, and I submitted 250 alternative titles, one of which was Waiting for Snow in Havana. And that became the title for that book, which I was actually just ripping off Monty Python, the Dead Parrot skit. I don't know if you're familiar with it, where this customer comes back to a pet shop and says, my parrot is dead, and the pet shop owner keeps saying, no, he's not dead. He's a Norwegian parrot. He's just pining for fjords. So the title actually has gotten more attention, I think, than the book. But to cut to the chase, when I was given the Riggs chair, another wake-up moment. One of my colleagues, I won't say which department, said, why'd they give you that chair? You're not Catholic. I said, but I am. And this person actually stuttered for about 30 seconds. But you're so tolerant. Which woke me up to the fact that maybe I had hidden my Catholic identity a little too much. Not long after that, well, actually it was like a decade later. But to God, a year is like a second, and so on and so forth. About a decade later, I get an email, I think it was, or a phone call, from Jeff Brenzel, a member of this community, who at that time was, he was no longer admissions dean, but he was still head of Timothy Dwight College. So anyway, we cooked up this course, the Catholic Intellectual Tradition. And the rest, as they say, is history. I have met kinds of students I have not met before teaching this course. It's a course for the curious. Doesn't matter where they're coming from, the curious people, but it's important, I think. Then I found out that there are many other Catholic universities that actually have a course with that same exact title. Probably a very different course, but the title has kind of become commonplace at Catholic institutions of higher learning. And this is how I want to close the talk, about all these unexpected things and all these unexpected twists and turns and things that you don't see and things that are invisible. My new book has had two very vitriolic, aggressive book reviews, one of which the first sentence is, "This book is deeply unserious," and the other one calls it silly. And both reviews assume that all of the testimonies that I have been using for this book are lies, that there are thousands of liars in the Catholic Church who have lied for centuries, saying that these things happen which are impossible. And fact is, as a historian, I have to say, I look at that evidence the way I look at any other evidence, because I'm skeptical at both ends of the spectrum. If you have testimonies from thousands of people over centuries about things happening, you can't just throw them out the window and say, no, they're all lying. So one has to be persistent. And I'm being persistent and continue to be persistent, that knowing the truth is very important to everyone. Knowing the truth, to anyone, any religious faith, knowing the truth about their faith is enormously important. Not knowing the past is like having amnesia or developing brain degenerative disease. You lose your memory, you lose your identity, you don't have yourself. The same thing is true about the history of Catholicism, the history of Christianity, the history of the church, the history of the Catholic intellectual tradition. And not knowing the past is very dangerous. Knowing the past is essential for survival in the present and the future. So I'll close with this anecdote, another bit of Jesuit slyness that I employed at my first job, my first full-time job at St. John's in Minnesota, a Benedictine school. I was teaching in the School of Theology. I was teaching seminarians. And I noticed that there was no survey of Catholic history, much less Christian history. So I went to the dean of the School of Theology and I said, Father Skidleric, we don't have a course on this subject. It's very important. His response, 1979. No, we don't need that. We're interested in what's happening now. Ooh, so I gave that some thought. A couple months later, I went back to him and said, I've got a great idea for a course next semester. History of heresy. And he said, wonderful. So I got to teach the history backwards. But I got to teach it anyway. So my advice to all of you, get engaged with faith, engage with others, but whenever possible, be sneaky and don't let people know what you're up to. right? And convince others of the truth by example, not by hammering them over the head with any kind of polemics. So, well, thank you for your attention. I guess it's question time now? Yeah.
So at this time, I'd like to ask anyone who has questions to come forward, and we can get started on the Q&A.
Well, thank you very much, Professor. And thank you on behalf of all the Catholic students that really had the privilege to take your courses, in particular the Catholic intellectual tradition, which really just for many of us was one of the few opportunities that we had to sort of engage the richness of the Catholic tradition in sort of in a very substantive way, sort of in a way which views the tradition as this awesome living reality, rather than just, from some kind of sociological lens or just, as sort of some artifact from the past. And as you sort of bring up, there seems to be in Yale and other places like Yale, either people that don't see the need for, this kind of engagement, or maybe even some people that don't, have some sort of active, dislike for this sort of engagement. And I wonder if you have any advice for us here at Yale as students, or as community members, or those of us here at Thomas More. Sort of, what do you think we can do, particularly here at Yale, to try to ensure that that kind of engagement with the Catholic tradition sort of continues for generations to come?
Yeah, well, great question, and I think there are various levels at which it can take place. And I think you're speaking of engagement in the classroom.
Right.
Yeah,
right,
that's trickier than engagement in a community like this. I mean, this is engagement here, and much easier to continue. The problem with engagement in the classroom is that you have to have faculty who are willing to sponsor that engagement in their classrooms. And we have 2 Catholic chairs here, one and one at the Divinity School. It's essential to keep an eye on those chairs, and to, if possible, and no, I don't mean it in a sense of spying on the chairs, no, to keep an eye on what might happen when the people holding these chairs retire, and who replaces them. That's whatever can be done at this level to make sure that the process works the way it's supposed to, the search process, right? That's very important. And if at all possible, to get funding for more Catholic chairs, because there are chairs in specific areas. And I know I served as chair of religious studies for 3 years, and we had a problem because we had too many, so the administration told me as chair, you have too many chairs in Judaic studies. We can't allow you to have any more. So there was funding for more chairs, but the administration just would not allow it. So that has to be carefully watched. And I don't know how that can be done, because search processes are closed. They're kind of like a Vatican conclave to elect a pope. You got to wait for the smoke to come out. But that's a great question. And I would say, any class that has engagement, any classroom engagement, maybe create an additional space here for those who are taking those courses to continue the study, analysis, and meditation.
Thank you, Professor.
Thanks, Mike.
question. Yeah. So, you spoke of the role of Thomas à Kempis's imitation in your childhood formation. Do you believe these older texts that we work with, these medieval, Renaissance, and Reformation texts, the kind of thing we read continually, they have something to say to contemporary Catholics continuously? Or do we have to continuously understand them in a historical basis? How do you balance that?
I think both things happen with these texts. Yeah, some speak across centuries much more clearly than others. And something like, for instance, the Cloud of Unknowing speaks across centuries much more cogently in some way than the Imitation of Christ. The very dualistic perspective of some of these devotional texts just don't ring as true in our day and age as they did in the past. But other books of devotion and theology, and theology, well, to read Aquinas, you need to get some training before you actually read Aquinas and understand what he's saying. But yeah, no, all these texts from the past are so important. And sometimes the farther back you go, honestly, the farther back you go, sometimes the more appropriate those texts become for the present. And Augustine is a prime example. But yeah, another anecdote that points to this issue is how one article I wrote, which was very obscure, has elicited the most email. And it was an article on translations of medieval mystical devotional texts in the early modern period. I gave it at a French conference in Paris, and something very funny happened, because at the dinner table, someone with very bad manners started whispering, this guy over here, Carlos, he won the National Book Award in the United States. And suddenly the conversation stopped. And someone asked, well, for what book? And I said, for this Waiting for Snow in Havana. And a fellow scholar, also in my field, went like this. Oh, you know what that means, don't you? That means you're going to be remembered for that book. I said, that's fine with me. And the French historian who had assembled the conference said, as only a French historian can, with lots of malice. Well, you certainly won't be remembered for that paper you gave us today. But it has elicited the most email of anything. So, and people say, thank you, Fred, thank you. I find these texts in your article so useful.
Do you have any more questions in the audience? I think you're up first. Go for it.
Hello, Professor. 2 questions. First, have you ever been able to travel back to Cuba, or would you even want to? And then second, who's your favorite not saint, or at least not proclaimed a saint, Catholic in Catholic history?
Oh, wow. That second question is a great question. I have to give that some thought. The first question, no, I would never want to go back. And number 2, I can't go back. I was notified by the State Department after winning the award for my book that I was on the list of enemies, and I better not travel. Highest honor I've ever received. But I have no family there anyway. And for all of you here, if you travel to Cuba, a huge percentage of every dollar you spend goes directly to fund the dictatorship. Clear as day if you just look deep enough. So no, I don't want to go back. A non-canonized Catholic. Flannery O'Connor. Yes. Yeah, definitely. There's someone else too, who goes unseen. This woman my wife knew, Catherine Doherty. She was a friend of Dorothy Day. She established Madonna House in Canada. She flies under the radar, so to speak. She was a Russian noble who escaped the Russian Revolution, and of course was very very Eastern Orthodox in her perspective on Catholicism. So I highly recommend her works, which are in English.
She wrote Bustinia.
Bustinia, yes, yeah. And she was very serious about poverty and self-abnegation at Madonna House. It's a very hardcore place, sort of like Dorothy Day's places. She had this story to tell about going to visit Dorothy Day one time in New York, and there was no bed for her. And she said, well, I can't stay here. I don't have a place to sleep. And Dorothy Day said, yes, you're sleeping here, in that cot with this woman who was infested with lice. And she did. Kind of like Mother Teresa, actually, connection with Cuba. Mother Teresa's nuns were allowed to set up shop, quote unquote, in Cuba because they actually did. They actually helped the poor, unlike the government. But I heard this story from somebody who knew the sisters in Havana, that in another place they were offered a very nice house. And Mother Teresa said, no, can't have it. It's too nice. So there are these saints who are hard to follow in their tracks.
Thanks for this wonderful talk. I have sort of the flip side question to what was just asked, which is I'd be curious to know more about how you got to the point where you wanted to write the biography of Saint Teresa of Avila. What was going on at that time, and how did that come to be?
Well, great. Yes. Actually, that goes way back to early childhood. If I had been a girl, my parents would have named me Teresa. And I think my mom was always disappointed. Just in that, not being able to. I studied Teresa deeply, began in college, reading The Interior Castle, and she always seemed to me to have a very special voice. So the book of her life is what I wrote about. Princeton University Press started this wonderful series, Lives of Great Religious Books. And for instance, the first volume they published was the Book of Mormon. So someone wrote a history of the Book of Mormon. And they approached me and said, do you have a great religious book that you would like to write a history of? And I didn't have to think twice. I said, Book of My Life, also known as the autobiography. I was surprised by the editor's response. He said, oh, if you do that, she will be our first woman author. And I thought for sure that there were other books in the series that, So anyway, it was just, again, one of these unexpected things. They came and asked me what I would like to do, and I didn't have to think twice. And boy, I had a great deal of fun writing that book because they had a word limit. was one of the reasons. I couldn't go over a certain number of words. So I was able to just focus on the most important things about how it came to be and what its meaning was. And in the final chapter, or the epilogue, I can't remember which of the two, I get to take swipes at 21st century culture.
Would everyone please join me in thanking Professor Eire once again? Now I'd like to take a moment to tell you about more of our upcoming programming here this very month at Thomas More. In anticipation of the Feast of St. Francis of Assisi on October 4th, St. Thomas More invites all of you to a multi-event celebration entitled Brother Sun, Sister Moon, a celebration of St. Francis of Assisi and his environmental legacy. So we'll begin with a historical lecture on September 26th with Yale Divinity School professor Volker Lepine. He might be known to some of you. He's a great German scholar of the Lutheran tradition, but also of the medieval tradition. So our celebration will feature speakers and interactive events like a blessing of the animals. For example, always a good one, maybe Heidi and Dan will show up, who knows, which elucidates the impact of St. Francis's creation mysticism, both in his own medieval era and today in the pontificate of Pope Francis and his, of course, his encyclical Laudato Si. It will highlight the Catholic tradition's long history of environmentalism and its ongoing influence in global debates surrounding conservation, climate activism, and ethical consumption. The lectures will be live streamed for those wishing to join our celebration from home and abroad. And for those wishing to join in person, please stay tuned to our website and social media for forthcoming details on participation and registration. Finally, thank you for joining us here this evening at St. Thomas More. Good evening and God bless. Thank you.